After how good episode 1 was and how it completely crushed my expectations, I was really excited for episode 2. As of writing this, I've completed the first zone, and unfortunately that excitement is gone. First of all, the stop and go level design is almost entirely gone, which is part of what I loved about episode 1. Now the game expects you to keep your momentum up like the classics, even when platforming and during obstacles. You do still stop frequently though, just not for platforming. Instead, you stop to use the buddy moves with tails or interact with objects that change the environment, such as a switch that opens a door with a spin dash. The biggest problem with this is the stopping is entirely superfluous. Instead of stopping to take in your environment or to get through a tight platforming section, you're stopping, pressing the spin dash buttons, then going again. There's nothing interesting here at all. There's not even a way to do it faster. The buddy moves are a little more interesting. Them forcing you to stop entirely is fine in this first level since you're just learning them, but every single time you use them it plays an animation of Sonic and Tails clasping hands before actually performing the move. Honestly, this really wouldn't even be an issue at all if the level design was more like episode 1, but because the game expects you to keep more momentum and has more of a focus on speed, it just feels bad. The very first act even commits the cardinal sin of unavoidable obstacles. Granted, none of them kill you, they just send you to the slower path, but they still don't feel good. Mastering an obstacle to go faster is much better than not being able to react, so you just have to remember to jump here next time. On top of all that, it's a water level. The first zone, the first act nonetheless, is a water level. It doesn't feel as bad as the classics because the air dash once again, but the focus on speed makes the difference between moving in the air and in the water so much more apparent. Speaking of, the homing attack as a whole just feels bad here because of the level design. The small change in level design, adding speed-based platforming that doesn't need speed, especially because of the buddy moves, completely ruins the feel of the game. This makes all the other changes the game made for the better, the visuals, the music, the sound effects, the buddy moves, all of it feel wasted. They would be much better used in the first episode, or with that level design at the very least. I really wish the buddy moves could have been used to their full potential. The flight makes for a perfect way to have more complex and challenging platforming with the potential to master it and go faster without raising the skill floor of the game as a whole, but instead it's just used as a boring gimmick and a get-out-of-jail-free card for difficult platforming. There are sections with moving platforms on cycles, but again the focus on speed makes them feel out of place and annoying. On top of there being multiple cycles that are out of sync with each other, making getting on the wrong cycle feel even worse. At least Sylvania Castle isn't just Green Hill again. The special stages are basically just Sonic 2 special stages, running down a half-pipe, collecting enough rings to get the Chaos Emerald by the end. These are generally considered to be the worst special stages in the series, and for good reason. In Sonic 2, they required memorization because of the tiny render distance. This could have been fixed in this game, as the render distance isn't significantly limited here, and instead of using that to create interesting and fun special stages with harder obstacle layouts, they make the path constantly twist and turn with rings placed on the turns that are impossible to react to. This honestly wasn't even that bad in Sonic 2, as you could try again at every single checkpoint, but the only way to enter a special stage in this game is at the very end of a stage, like Sonic 1 and Episode 1, so if you mess up, you either have to replay the entire stage, or move on to the next stage and hope you make it to the end with 50 rings, which is made exponentially harder because of the focus on speed and memorization anyway. Hell, the 4th Emerald took me 8 tries to get, that's more than any boss in Dark Souls 1 in my first playthrough. On top of all of that, it doesn't even have the physics of the Sonic 2 special stages. Jumping on one side of the half-pipe doesn't send you to the other side based on the slope, you just go straight up and down. You can use momentum to go up off the side, but it feels unintuitive and strange, to the point that it took until the final special stage for me to notice that you could do it at all. I thought you had to go to the edge and jump, which made the physics changes even more apparent and feel so much worse. They could have done what Sonic Colors DS did and made a good version of these special stages, but instead they made them with all the flaws of Sonic 2 without the boons of Sonic 2, such as so many tries at them. There are even obstacles that just slow you down, being more annoying than anything. It doesn't even seem like Tails enjoys these, despite Sonic's encouragement. I don't understand how they made the special stages alone so much worse in the first episode, on top of the complete change of level design for the worse after one of my favorite Sonic games outright, while still somehow completely fixing all of my biggest problems with episode 1. It just reversed all the issues, made the gameplay bad and presentation good instead of good gameplay with bad ancillary stuff. I'm interjecting here after completing the 6th special stage. As it turns out, pausing and pressing retry in this special stage actually retries the special stage itself instead of the stage you got into it from. This was found out after Special Stage 4, which is way harder than the others for some reason, aside from 6 I guess. But the reason I thought this wouldn't work is the fact that you can't enter a special stage you haven't already completed from the level select, so it's still a major flaw, but it does make the special stages slightly less bad in my eyes. You can't pause after going through a ring gate though, so if you didn't collect enough rings without realizing it before going through the gate, you have to play another stage anyway. Speaking of flaws in the gameplay, Episode 1's level design complemented the physics, so it never expected you to roll up slopes, but because of the focus on speed in this game, rolling up slopes often seems expected and, at times, required, but because of the physics, it's nearly impossible to do for any period of time. At least Act 2 teaches you that you can use the flying buddy move to swim, which makes the water sections even less frustrating. That's one big positive for this game, for as sparse as I'm going to assume water levels are, given Episode 1's frequency. That said, Tails can steal air bubbles despite the fact that it doesn't matter if he drowns? That's kinda ridiculous. Sylvania Castle Act 2 even has obstacles that I praise Lost Labyrinth for not having, timed obstacles underwater. In this case, it's faces on the walls that shoot arrows and fish that swim towards you instead of just being on a cycle. Because it takes so long to fall down, sometimes these are just unfair to avoid. You can be facing away from the fish and falling with no way to avoid it because you can't homing attack it, and if you air dash, you'll fall straight into an arrow because it will keep you out of the path for just long enough for its cycle to line up. These kinds of obstacles are bad in general, not just in water, don't get me wrong, but the water exacerbates their flaws significantly. There's a cool platform here, a spring that floats in the water that you can flip over by homing attacking it, but it's used so poorly. They can take you to secret areas with power-ups or faster paths, but they don't feel like it's worth that, since they're so easy and simple to use. On top of being made essentially moot with the flying buddy move, instead of working in tandem with them to make even more interesting obstacles. Plus, a lot of them feel like they're placed without actually considering the surrounding level design. They can send you straight into ceilings or just an empty air gap above them. They're harmless, I suppose, if disappointing. For some reason, you have to unlock the buddy moves as you play through the game, instead of just being able to use them all from the beginning and learning how to use them through the game, or even in just a tutorial stage. It feels like they were trying to add Metroidvania elements, think the power-ups from the Adventure series or even 06 and Unleashed, but without the satisfaction of collecting something or finding something hidden in the level. There are no hub levels or anything, you just play a level, see a sign, use the ability, and now you have it for the rest of the game. Anyway, Act 3 itself is fine. You're taught how to use the Spin Dash buddy move, where Sonic and Tails turn into a ball together and can destroy certain obstacles. The problem with these obstacles though is that you don't need the ability to destroy most of them, meaning the much slower homing attack can be used for a good chunk of them without any opportunity for that to be corrected by the game itself. I only realized this in retrospect, but admittedly this one may be my fault. The ball buddy move essentially ignores physics entirely, meaning it can be used in place of rolling up a hill, but you can't use it in the previous stages, making that kind of move anyway. There are platforms that rotate when you homing attack them, which are interesting and could be used for more complex homing attack chains and platforming in general, but unfortunately they're usually paired with moving platforms or just a simple homing attack chain that could have just as easily been enemies. There are a couple instances where they're used for slightly more complex movement, but nothing drastic. There is a moving platform that doesn't move until you stand on it, but instead of being a test of your timing and skill, it's just touch this and then wait a second, which is really boring and annoying. This game so far has been full of wasted potential and pure disappointment. I hate being so negative towards this franchise, but I really want to like this game, and the shift from the previous one is so intense. I already expected to dislike Unleashed, so I really didn't get whiplash or anything from that game, but this one is just frustrating. The first boss for this game is, big surprise, Eggman. That's not a knock on the game or anything, I know I've been negative so far, but Eggman being the boss is fun. I actually prefer it to some random robot he made instead. Oh wait, just kidding, it's a giant plant robot. No, wait again, Eggman is inside the giant plant robot. This boss is okay. The biggest problem with it is the fact that the game just stops you so he can fly in, then fly back off screen before you run into the arena and actually fight him. This is such a pointless cutscene. There are just enough rings in this stage to turn into Supersonic if you have it unlocked, which I think is really cool, and was entirely impossible in the previous episode. I actually kinda like this, but I can also see the merit of forcing a fair fight. Eggman will occasionally lower down so you can hit it, but you can also use the flight buddy move to fly up and attack him that way. I don't know if this is actually how you're supposed to do this, but it worked, so whatever. It felt weird though. The tentacles on the side will occasionally swing and try to hit you, but the direction they actually attack in is not telegraphed well at all. It took me a few tries to learn how to actually avoid it. You had to avoid it a few times throughout the fight to make Eggman vulnerable at all, so I just flew upward every time it looked like they were going to attack, and it worked well enough. At the end of the fight, the tentacles attach to the main body and powered up or something, but you can destroy it fast enough to not even see an attack in the second phase, so it's kind of pointless. After Sylvania Castle, you have the choice between Oil Desert and White Park. I don't know why this presents a possible issue of poor difficulty scaling, but I honestly didn't notice much. I chose to play White Park first for no particular reason, but in retrospect this feels like the intended route. The statement about the music being better in this episode does not apply to the first act of the stage. It's repetitive and annoying here. Other than that though, this stage is awful. Right off the bat, after a little slope running section, because of course, you have to roll a snowball if you take the slower path, which is almost guaranteed because of this game's level design. You have to roll multiple through the stage regardless, so that's irrelevant anyway. This is another instance of go slower for a second just because, which are always so much fun. The faster path has a red star ring returning from other games, but instead of 5 per level, there's only 1 per act in this game. They're fine as collectibles, and getting them all unlocks an achievement. That's it. No more stages like in Colors. The Chaos Emeralds are here to unlock Supersonic, unlike Lost World. The only reason to collect them all is for a single achievement. That's disappointing, a running theme, I suppose. Anyway, other than the snowballs, there's not much worth talking about unique to this act specifically. There are avalanche sections that you have to run from and some that you have to board over the top of, but they're just hold forward sections, sometimes with opportunities to jump to alternate paths or goodies. This game has these sections in spades. Shortly after, you're introduced to the polar bear looking badnik that takes 3 homing attacks or a buddy roll to defeat, and is probably my biggest issue with this level as a whole. Well, not this one specifically, but how they use it later. It's in the middle of a flat area that you can't see coming because of how zoomed in the camera is. Did we learn nothing from Sonic Advanced? Honestly, zooming out the camera would solve a lot of my problems with this game. It did teach me to basically always use the buddy roll if I was on a flat surface, as you would use normal rolling in the classics, so that's good play conditioning I guess, but that would often cause me to go flying past the entrance to the special stage, which ruined it anyway. Right after the first polar bear, there's a snowball rolling down a hill that I have no idea how to avoid. I guess you can use the buddy flight system, but it's too fast to react to because of the animation completely stopping your momentum. Right after the second polar bear I mentioned earlier, there's a bunch of snow that you have to buddy roll through. The main problem with this is if you stop rolling at all, you immediately die, but the game doesn't tell you that. On top of that, losing too much speed makes you stop immediately, but it seems really inconsistent. I'd bonk and not stop rolling all the time, but there were other times that I would stop rolling for seemingly no reason. Right at the end of the stage, there's a spring that just wouldn't let me homing attack it for some reason. It happened several times, I don't know what's going on with that. Act 2 takes place at night and almost entirely on a roller coaster track, which is a cool set piece, but they don't really use it for anything. There are no roller coaster carts you have to avoid or anything, and the normal rock formations make the same kinds of loops and bumps anyway. A lot of the tracks here move back and forth, which is kind of against the stage theme now. Roller coaster tracks themselves don't move very often. The stage looks nice, but that's really all it has going for it, and the same look is carried through the entire stage, so it all blends together, unlike pretty much anything in the first game, which I specifically pointed out. This is the least I've had to say about any stage in either game, which is good for this game I suppose, but reflects poorly on the stage in general I think, since the first game was mostly praise. At least I don't have to berate this stage too much, it's just kinda boring. Initially, Act 3 was my favorite level in the game so far, but because of the issues with the special stages that I mentioned earlier, I had to replay it several times, which made me dislike it more and more with each new attempt. First of all, the good. The act actually uses the buddy mechanic in a unique and interesting way. You use the swim ability through most of the stage, leading to a unique experience from the rest of the game as a whole, despite using this specific ability even in the first act. That does mean that it's a water level, but again, it's used well in my opinion. There are obstacles that add even more time pressure with these walrus badniks that freeze the water in a circle around them if you're not quick enough, blocking off paths and potentially damaging you if they freeze you in their little circle. My biggest problem with them is that the ice is a circle, and because the first one you see is against a floor, it seems like you can push it. You're supposed to swim over it instead. It's a minor issue admittedly, but still worth pointing out. There are points you can swim through and points you can run through, but the other method would be faster, so you have to decide which movement method to use at your own discretion. There are also moving platforms because of the slower pace of the level as a whole and the focus on different kinds of movement and time pressure from the water. I actually think they largely work pretty well in this act. As a whole, this level uses the gimmick to its advantage instead of as an afterthought, and I think it's done pretty well despite the game's failings in other areas. That said, there are a lot of issues with this act that I began to notice as I played it more and more. First of all, the biggest offense, there is a single polar bear, once again on a flat path, that you cannot possibly see coming if you're trying to go fast, and it immediately precedes a section where you need to fly through, meaning if you buddy roll through it, you then have to immediately get out of the roll and wait until you land so you can jump again and use the flight. This is just unnecessary and annoying, and it's absolutely a microcosm of the game's issues. Tails grabbing the bubble instead of Sonic is infuriating in this level as well, because of how much water there is, especially at the end, where there's only a single bubble at the end of a huge stretch of water that you have to swim through quickly enough. I never got to this bubble without the drowning countdown starting. Speaking of this section though, it's almost really good. You have to swim through some spikes that are pretty close together, which is really fun, especially since they're not so close as to be annoying. It's then followed by a section where you essentially just mash the swim button while holding forward, except that's not true. There are 3 sets of walruses here that block the path entirely if you're not fast enough, leaving you to drown with no recourse. This is fine, I suppose. I like the time pressure, especially after the precision swimming section. It adds suspense and requires skill, but the water itself already has time pressure, making the walruses entirely superfluous. On top of this, they're just barely at different heights, meaning if you pass the first one just fine and keep pulling forward, there's a chance you'll hit the second one. The difference is incredibly subtle, and because of the game design conventions, it really seems like you should be able to go through at the same height, but they just aren't. Plus, if you die here, you literally can't make it into the special stage. There aren't enough rings between the last checkpoint and the end of the stage, despite this being the hardest part of the stage by far. The boss here is Metal Sonic. It's almost a fine boss. You just have to chase it and smack him a few times, which is easiest done with the buddy roll. At first you'll go off screen every so often and charge the path you're on, as there are springs that make you go into the background. You'll then start spawning electricity obstacles that you have to jump through, which are unnecessarily difficult to dodge with how the physics work, with the screen constantly moving. Getting hit really isn't much of an issue though because of how many rings are on the tracks. I didn't die once to this boss because I ran out of rings. I did die to this boss, however, because of one specific attack. After the phase where he spawns electricity, he destroys portions of the track. You can jump it, but then you'll fall straight into the next hole he makes, so you have to use the buddy flight. But there's essentially no way to know that in your first attempt, continuing the theme of unreactable obstacles. After that he charges you and you just have to hit him once, but that one attack killed me 3 times because it doesn't telegraph how you're supposed to avoid it whatsoever. Oil Desert Act 1 is the first act to really focus on a gimmick. Other levels had gimmicks like the snowballs or the walruses, but this is the first time it really feels like a gimmick. As you go through, wind will start pushing you around, generally hindering your progress, but as I'll talk about later, can also help you along. The main enemy type here is a dung beetle looking robot, but instead of dung, it rolls bombs at you. These aren't great. Most of the time they're placed next to others, and it's possible for them to stagger their attacks in such a way that it's impossible to dodge both of them if you don't already know it's coming. That really is this game's motif, huh? Anyway, the bombs can also be unnecessarily hard to dodge because the physics on them don't feel natural, on top of the fact that they can hurt you while they're being spawned in the first place, and you can't really attack a beetle before the bomb is rolled away. There was an instance where I was rolling through an area and saw a spring coming up, but I didn't avoid it because I thought it would send me on another path, chemical plant style. Instead, it sent me hurtling into a bomb because of course it did. At the end of the stage, they actually use the wind in an interesting and fun way. You have to fly with the wind pushing you forward, avoiding obstacles and collecting rings. This would be way cooler if it was actually used through the stage instead of a, hey, what if we did this, at the very end, but I digress. Still a cool moment regardless. I want to stop here for a minute before moving on to Oil Desert Act 2 to talk about Special Stage 7. I know I said Special Stages 4 and 6 were ridiculously difficult, but 7 takes it to an entirely different level. It took me over 40 minutes to finally beat the special stage and get my final Chaos Emerald. The longest one it took me prior to this was 10 minutes, aside from re-entering the special stage in 4, prior to knowing that you could reset in the stage itself. If I had to redo a stage every single time I wanted to try Special Stage 7, I don't think I would be getting all the Chaos Emeralds. It genuinely would not be worth it. Either that, or I'd restart the game and get 7 on the first act. What makes it so bad? Where do I start? First of all, it relies heavily on this buddy tether thing, where all the rings between Sonic and Tails are collected. This is annoying because you can't directly control Tails, but it's learnable, I guess. The stage begins with the left-right pattern and carries it through a good chunk of the stage, but breaks it just before the first ring gate. This really wouldn't be that bad if it didn't also have a terrible camera angle here so you can't see where you're going. It's learnable though, I guess, so fine. This isn't that bad, and it's like 20 seconds into the stage. It continues with the left-right pattern though, so I don't understand the intention behind breaking it. The next section has a lot of spikes with a terrible camera angle, a huge section of the stage where you rely entirely on memorization and simply can't react to what's coming up. You need to collect at least 150 rings in this section. In my first attempt, I collected 50. Just before the next ring gate though, there's a tube with a spiral of rings that goes around it with a tether power-up just prior. Collecting the power-up is near impossible because of the angle of the camera, despite being directly in the middle of the stage, but even when you do get it, it's impossible to actually go around the spiral. Oh wait, no it's not. You just need to use the boost. It has been entirely useless through all of the special stages and outright detrimental most of the time because it's impossible to react to anything most of the time that was mentioned once at the very beginning of the first special stage. Alright, fine, you use the boost to collect as many rings as you can in the spiral. Most of the time I'd collect around 100 rings here, but in my winning attempt I managed to get about 175. It feels almost random how many you get, but according to a random YouTube comment under a video of a walkthrough of this exact special stage, that also mentioned it feels random by the way, it is possible to get all 500 rings you need to finish the stage by this point, but you only actually need to collect 350 to get past this ring gate. That must mean it's easy to win from here, right? Well, if you don't get more than 350, you need every single ring past this point. all of which are spawned by time gates and disappear after a little bit. If you manage to collect every ring for a specific gate, you get 20 rings. Some of them are near impossible to get all of, and even the easiest ones felt like a crapshoot most of the time. This isn't the first time a Sonic game has pushed me to the brink of tears from frustration. I'm looking at you, Eggman Land. But on top of how not good this game as a whole has been up to this point, I'm genuinely annoyed that there's still more game to play at this point. 4 zones was way too many, not too few. It's hard to explain just how frustrating the special stage is without playing it yourself, but I would not recommend that torment. Oil Desert Act 2's gimmick is quicksand. You have to jump to avoid getting sucked under, and in some areas there are sandworm things constantly jumping out that you have to avoid. A lot like Sonic Lost World, actually. There are also the oil slides from Oil Ocean, but other than that, it's a pretty normal stage, but this time for the better. Instead of having speed sections and platforming sections at speed, it's almost entirely speed sections where you're skirting across a quicksand to avoid sandworms. The oil slides carry you forward, so it's not like those are really obstacles or anything. The times that the stage does have platforming, it's just homing attacks over a pit, or a simple jump that doesn't kill you if you fail it at speed. Act 3 is probably my favorite level in the entire game so far. There are oil slicks that Badnik set on fire. The specific Badnik that sets them on fire is weird. It appeared before, but you didn't really need to interact with it, just go past. But here you're very close to it, and one of them is even in a homing attack chain, so their flaws are more apparent. Namely the fact that the flames can damage you prior to them visually appearing. It just leads to a faster path, but it's worth mentioning. The main gimmick is these silos that slowly fill with sand while you're in them. These are kind of auto-scrollers, but you can usually outpace them with the buddy flight and then springs placed inside of them. The first one is really simple and easy, just get to the top with a couple opportunities to go faster, but the second forces you to outrun the sand rather than wait for it to carry you up. You have to homing attack a couple walls and quickly break them, and use the buddy moves to get through quick enough to avoid being crushed. The third and final one incorporates the dung beetle badniks and spikes you can begin to fly across before the sand actually covers them, allowing you to escape. I love how the gimmick progressively gets harder and is used more in different ways as the level goes on top of the gimmick focusing on the game's strengths, in this case forcing you to slow down for platforming, which is perfectly complemented by the pure speed sections. There's also a Team Blast item box in this level where you mash A to get more points and it kills everything on screen. I don't know if this was introduced somewhere else, but this is the first place that I found it. By far the best stage so far, and surprisingly fun for the standard the game is set. The boss for this zone is Eggman again, but this time he has a trash robot. He has a magnet under his Eggmobile and somehow makes a robot out of the trash. This is a really fun boss, if overdone, since it takes around 4 minutes to beat. He constantly drops boxes down on you, but there are arrows showing where the boxes will be, so it's a test of your attention rather than reaction, making sure that you're not going to be standing where a box ends up. Later on, boxes have spikes that come out at the top every now and then, and even bombs start getting dropped, testing even more of your attention. Every so often, he opens up the cockpit, allowing you to hit him. I don't know why he doesn't just keep it closed. I assume he can't see, but that seems like a pretty big design flaw. At the end of the fight, he jumps around at the surface, and you have to buddy roll into his foot in order to get in the final hit. I wish it would let you figure this out, but there's a big floating sign there, like everywhere else where you have to use other buddy moves. Oh well, I guess it's still a fun fight. The final full zone is Sky Fortress Zone. It starts off with a Sky Chase level because of course it does. It isn't called Sky Chase, but it's Sky Chase. I don't think there's been a single good level involving the tornado in any Sonic game. Adventure 1s could be beaten without touching the controller, Unleashed's was terrible, and this one fares no better. It's a slow 6-minute autoscroller with no way to influence how quickly you get through it. It's slow, it's boring, and I really don't have much to say about it. There's a short platforming section in the middle where you have to homing attack across some enemies, but it's nothing new or special. You do get a glimpse of this zone's boss here, but you don't fight it at all, so it doesn't really matter. Act 2 is literally just Flying Battery. Different layout, I guess, but the level gimmick is the fans, the aesthetics are exactly the same, it's just Flying Battery. I don't really mind the reuse of the aesthetics like this, but the gimmick is that it's reused. I don't know, it just feels worse than the other reuses of places. It probably doesn't help that I don't like Flying Battery to begin with. The level itself is fine, if nothing else. There's nothing unfair or frustrating. It's another boring level because the gimmick isn't a gimmick, and it's just something another game had. The 2 proper levels in this zone share a lot of obstacles though, such as grates you have to run along like Super Mario World, but you have to go fast along them or fall off, as well as jet engines that can hit you if they're going off as you pass. This is also the first time in the whole game that the homing attack not making the camera follow you was really an issue. The problem was present in the first episode, but it didn't really cause any issues until now, as here you actually have to follow a large chain of enemies. Luckily, the enemies themselves leave behind a platform when they die, so it isn't too bad, but it's still apparent and greatly slows you down. The gimmick of Act 3 is ostensibly cannons, but instead of being cool and fun and interesting like in the first episode, these ones automatically fire you on a set path. This means you're just not playing the game for half of the act, It's not terrible, and it's a nice spectacle, but this encapsulates for the final time how this episode took everything from the first episode and just made it worse. Other than the gimmick, once again, there's nothing really special here, and it's not like this gimmick is unique. It behaves exactly the same as the pipes and chemical plant. There is a section where you have to time your flying with jet engines to make it across large gaps, but it's no more difficult than Oil Desert Act 1, and because there's no wind, it's less fun too. There are jet engines at the background that look like they're in the foreground but can't actually hurt you, and they're always on, so that kinda tripped me up. The boss is once again Metal Sonic, but this time it's Sky Chase, a 6-minute Sky Chase boss, because of course. It's not the worst. You need to dodge some lasers, hit Metal Sonic at the front of his little ship, dodge some more lasers and badniks, and again, then boost into him at the end. The only complaints I have, aside from Sky Chase in general, is that he can go under you in the first phase for some of his attacks, leaving him entirely invulnerable, which is just annoying. And in the final phase, there are missiles in the background that are not differentiated nearly enough from the missiles in the foreground. Plus, it's not telegraphed that you can boost into him, which is a problem because this is the only time you can do it. The final zone is the Death Egg Mark II. Why is the Death Egg here? Where did it come from? Did it show up earlier and I just wasn't paying attention? Probably. There's a normal-ish level, kind of, and then a boss. The zone's gimmick is gravity. Every slope changes the gravity as you go along it, as well as some spots that just change the gravity for seemingly no reason. There are very few obstacles in the entire stage, so it's really annoying and boring to run through, especially with the gravity switching everywhere, but at least there are checkpoints. There are 2 encounters with Metal Sonic, the first with Eggman also being there. He gets in his Eggmobile and you have to navigate around him to attack Metal. Metal also fires giant balls of electricity that are really difficult to dodge, but it's the final zone, so I suppose that's expected. They behave independently, so it's not like every time Eggman moves is an opportunity to attack Metal, but they usually line up well enough. Just pay attention to Metal's behavior, and it's not too bad. After a few hits, you move on to a short section of stage, and then another encounter. This time you're racing Metal Sonic through a corridor with walls closing ahead of you that you need to get ahead of. It's pretty fun and requires you to react to get a good time. It gives you enough of a grace period at the end with a bunch of walls that it takes Metal longer to break than you, that you can still get through if you don't know what's coming. The final boss is, big surprise, Eggman, in a mech that looks like a heart. He summons 3 rings that you have to platform around, or just fly to the middle one in order to smack him. He starts making the rings have patches of electricity you need to avoid, and eventually has a barrier around him that you need to buddy roll into before actually attacking. On top of that, for every hit, you can't hit the bottom of it. You have to make sure to go around to the top, but you even have to fly to hit at the end of the fight. This is a much better final act than the first episode, but it still takes way too many hits to take it down. Unfortunately, there's still one more thing to do before I never have to think about this game again. Episode Metal. If you have save data from Episode 1, Episode Metal unlocks after finishing the first zone. You play through a remixed version of each Act 1 from Episode 1. The differences are generally pretty drastic, from simple changes like enemy placement and object placement, to full-on changes in the level's geometry. I wouldn't have minded them reusing the entire act with a few more enemies, but this is also appreciated. The episode uses the art style from Episode 1 for some reason, but I don't really mind as long as the levels are good. Unfortunately, they're a bit of a mixed bag. The worst level by far is Act 1, which is a spin on Mad Gear Act 1. It uses the steam vents and the same enemies and stuff, but everything is placed in much worse spots. There are crab meats placed on ledges that can hit you before you have the chance to react, but this time they're on the required path, unlike the mantis from Episode 1. There are mantises on the tops of ledges from elevators, there are vents blasting into each other, it's ridiculous. Speaking of, this game plays itself a lot more than the first episode. The vents blasting into other vents, the cannons from Sky Fortress, the buddy roll wall sections, most of the criticisms I've heard about Episode 1 apply here in spades, but not so much to Episode 1. Anyway, on top of the placement, there are also just more enemies in general. I don't know why badniks are attacking Metal Sonic in the first place, but I do think it's really cool that you get to play as Metal Sonic at all. The only mainline single-player game where that's possible otherwise is Sonic Adventure 1 as an unlockable for collecting all the emblems. He's playable in most of the party games, racing games, rivals, and as a multiplayer option in, say, Adventure 2 or Heroes, but this is one of the only 2 times that he's playable in his own level, and Sonic Adventure 1 was just reusing Emerald Coast. The fact that this episode uses the level design of the second game with the abilities of the first is a sin. No buddy roll or flight to catch you from unfair obstacles or anything. The worst part of the level, in my opinion, is a row of pistons that you can't see coming and have to time well to get past. But if you're just running through, you'll get crushed by them. Other than that though, this stage is definitely better than Special Stage 7, or Lost Labyrinth Act 2, or the final act of Episode 1. Act 2 is Lost Labyrinth Act 1. Thankfully we don't have to go through Act 2 this time. As far as I can tell, actual obstacle layouts are used more frequently in this act than Act 1, but again, that doesn't really bother me. The worst difference between the 2 games is the pikes that shoot out of the wall from Labyrinth Zone, to Genesis 1, not Lost Labyrinth, which I praise the first game for not doing. There are full ball-rolling tracks ripped straight from the first episode, and it was fun to notice that. There are two sections where you run away from rolling balls, and to my recollection there was only one in the first episode, but I digress. I'm not here to point out the differences. I'm here to critique the quality of the stage itself. There's some actually fun underwater movement here where you're given an invincibility power-up, and if you're fast enough can take out a bunch of the badniks surrounded by floating spike balls, and the ones that are periodically covered in spikes, and they're placed in a way that they flow really well together and even let you get through the area a whole lot faster. Significantly better as a whole than Act 1, but nowhere near how fun the first episode was with the same act. There aren't any egregious examples of obstacles appearing out of nowhere, at least. Act 3 is the first act of Zone 2 from Episode 1. I trust you recognize the pattern by now. This level has very few reused sections, but it uses the exact same gimmicks as the first episode. This is probably my favorite act in the entire game, aside from Oil Desert Act 3, as there are no unfair obstacles. The stage is fun and unique, to this episode anyway, and the nature of the pinball itself forces you to slow down for the platforming despite allowing speed if you're able to control it well enough. There are some moving platforms, but they don't bother me too much because the pinball is slow anyway, so it doesn't break the set pace. There are even obstacles that have a pretty high skill floor that aren't required to actually beat the act. This is a pretty good act and makes me wish the whole game was designed like this. I'm simply longing for what could have been. Act 4, instead of being a boss, is Splash Hill Act 1. I like that there wasn't a boss here since you fight Metal Sonic in this game anyway. I played through this act in Episode 1 a lot to get the run where I beat it in under a minute, so I know it pretty well, and that knowledge did not help me in the least here because of how different it is. There's still some reused areas, but they're all remixed in some way, either with new obstacles or enemies, or even connected to entirely different sections of levels. This level is pretty fun, but there are definitely instances of unfair obstacles here, despite most of the platforming happening in slower areas. It's also pretty short, as I beat it in under 2 minutes on my first try. Not as good as Act 3, but significantly better than Acts 1 and 2. This one was definitely fun, at least. Episode Metal as a whole is fine, better than the base game, but also really short, being just 4 acts. And that's Sonic 4 Episode 2. Episode 1 is way better, and that really encapsulates all my feelings with this game. There are a lot of really annoying things in this game, a lot of things you can't see coming, a lot of areas that attempt and fail to combine speed and platforming, and a lot of design sensibilities coming from the classics that both aren't fun in general, but especially don't work with this game as a whole, with the differing physics and abilities, especially the homing attack. As a whole, I didn't hate it. I won't be replaying it, especially with that damn Special Stage 7, but I liked it significantly more than Unleashed, for example. The music, as I said, is way better than Episode 1, along with the visuals, but that really doesn't matter as much as the level design, which bleeds heavily into the gameplay. For a score, I think I'm gonna have to give this a 6.5. Special stages, most of the level design in the first playthrough, specifically the Metal Sonic bosses, they bring the game down heavily. But replaying it, the visuals, music, Oil Desert Act 3, and the satisfaction of having beat this game that I was immensely disappointed in as a whole for what could have been, bring it up a bit. I don't think I'll be replaying this anytime soon, but maybe nostalgia will bring me back eventually. Alright, so I haven't had time to work on anything for like the last 2 weeks. I'm gonna try to get my Frontiers video out soon after the Update 3 is released. I have beaten the game, I just need to finish up the script and then record that, and then edit that, and then hopefully I'll have all the editing done for that done. Yeah, all of that done before the Update 3 comes out, so that I can make the episode, or the Update 3 section and append it onto that. And then I want to do Origins before Superstars comes out, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that. We'll see. So those are my plans for the upcoming videos, whatever. We'll see what happens. But thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I love you all, and I don't know how to end this.